Welcome to Risk REconsidered, the podcast where we explore the intersection of weather-related hazards, insurance and reinsurance, and how the industry can partner with other stakeholders to help societies become more resilient. I'm your host, Shari Elliker. Today we're focusing on one of the world's most costly and widespread perils, flooding. Nearly a third of the global population lives with this risk. Urbanization, economic development in vulnerable regions, inflation, and a changing climate are all contributing to losses. I'm joined today by two experts who live continents apart, but whose countries share this intensifying peril. Vineet Kumar, who has headed Swiss Re's catastrophe perils for the Asian Pacific region for more than a decade. He leads a team that provides evolving insights into natural catastrophes, insights that guide data-driven underwriting and risk management by Swiss Re, and Andrew Hall, Executive Director of the Insurance Council of Australia, which represents insurers including Swiss Re. In recent years, including 2025, Australia has endured historic floods, sparking a national conversation about preparedness. The Council is an active participant in this dialogue on behalf of the insurance industry. Vineet and Andrew, welcome to Risk REconsidered. Andrew, let's start in your country. Australian states like Queensland and New South Wales experience regular flooding, but the events in 2022 were historic. What trends are you seeing and how are they shaping the industry's response?
Well, Shari, flood is one of our biggest challenges in Australia. We do share a number of the other perils that other countries face, such as cyclone and bushfires, or wildfires, as you would say in North America. But flood is our most costly peril that we face. And in particular on the east coast of Australia, in the eastern states, Queensland, New South Wales, down into Victoria, into the city of Melbourne, for example, a lot of our largest population centres have grown up around very large river systems. These river systems feed off a dividing range that runs parallel to the east coast of Australia. And what we see is when there's very large weather events, those river systems act as enormous stormwater drains, and of course, they turn into flood events and impact very large populations. In fact, our third largest city, Brisbane, sits on a very big river delta, and it's often referred to as a river with a city problem. So we do have a challenge in Australia when it comes to flood. The height of the challenge was, I think, exposed in 2022 when we had a flood year where it wasn't just one event, although we did have one significant event at the start of that year, but it actually moved down the east coast over a number of months and impacted a number of communities and really highlighted that there are a number of factors that have come together in Australia that have contributed to the high risk exposure of flood that we've got going on, particularly on the east coast.
Now, Vineet, you're based in India. The monsoon has always been a defining part of life in India, but we're seeing rainfall patterns change with the climate. What's most important for people to understand about how this hazard is changing in India, but also elsewhere in Asia where your team is tracking flood risk?
Yeah, so summer monsoon in India ended a few months ago. So overall rainfall was about 8% higher than the average, which is within the normal range as defined by India Meteorological Department. But if you look at the news over many months in India, nothing appears normal. Most of the cities have suffered severe flooding. Why is that? Let me share two aspects of changes in rainfall pattern to explain this apparent contradiction, lot of flooding despite a normal year. First, while India's annual rainfall, which is about a meter, hasn't changed much over the year, it has become more uneven. Regions like central India, where Mumbai is, are getting wetter, while areas in the northeast closer to Himalayas becoming drier and more variable. Second, with climate change, we know warmer air can hold more moisture, and what that means when it rains hard. We are seeing increased frequency of short and intense outbursts of rainfall, 10 to 15 centimeters of rainfall within a few hours. The ground and drainage system can't absorb it fast enough. That leads to flash flood on one side. Then between these bursts, the dry spells are getting longer. So we are also getting more vulnerable to the drought risk. And we are seeing this pattern is common across the Asia Pacific, be it Australia, be it Japan or Philippines. One thing I would like to highlight, particularly related to Asia Pacific, many of those countries, they also receive rainfall from cyclone and typhoons. So as we have seen recently, tragic devastation in Southeast Asia flood, where many cyclone systems interacted with the existing monsoon to cause record rainfall records. And also we have seen a rare cyclone Sanyar close to the tropical equator. So it's important we also understand how the behavior of these cyclone could change and influence the flood risk in Asia Pacific.
Okay, this is for both of you. Where do you see the biggest threat? Is it coming from more extreme rainfall, or do human factors like land use, urbanization, and planning challenges play an even more significant role?
So I think, Shari, it's a combination of both of those factors, but particularly, and Vineet referred to this as well, it's the growth of urbanisation in areas that have the exposure to the risk. It's the growth in the value of those assets in those areas, which are driven by demand on housing, population growth, immigration, all of those factors. Layer on the top of that more extreme weather events, plus also a changing urban landscape. So what we're seeing, for example, in Australia is that demand for new housing is seeing housing expand on the fringes of the cities. A lot of the traditional sponges that existed around cities, like swamps and the like, are being converted into housing locations. They're speeding up the water and how it travels. It's causing flash floods that Vineet referred to. Then it enters the riverine system, and the river itself rises faster and higher and impacts a lot more of assets in the CBD, for example. So I think it's a combination of both of these factors. And what we're seeing, particularly in Australia, is that governments are under extreme pressure to find housing solutions for a growing population. And when that occurs, other factors probably get dropped down the prioritisation list. One of those being, what is the flood risk of the property look to be developed? So the development is happening, and it's only after the development's done that residents start discovering the peril risk they face, and more importantly, the insurance prices that they are facing to insure their homes. So it is a problem that we have to have a holistic approach to, particularly in Australia when it comes to land use planning, population growth and planning, and marry that alongside what we understand the flood behaviours are, and also what the modelling is telling us about future predictions.
Vineet, what do you see as the biggest threat?
Yeah, as Andrew mentioned, I think it's a combination of both climate change and human factors like urbanization, which are adding to this threat. What really important is the intersection of hazard, which is extreme rainfall layer, and exposure, which are influenced by human factor, that we understand really well and manage it so that keep the risk within the limit. So if I look at climate change, it is resetting the stage or changing the baseline by making the rainfall more extreme. But the scale of impact depends on how and where we build. And that kind of influenced by a lot of policy decision and other human factors. With floods, we need to be even more mindful. Human factors not only increasing the asset values, but also they change the landscape. In many Indian metro areas, the built-up footprint area has almost doubled in the past 2 decades. As green areas turn to concrete, the same rainfall now causes much more flooding because the water has nowhere to go. So I see in the short to medium term, for many growth markets in Asia Pacific, human factors plays a dominant role. But if I take a little longer time horizon, climate change can result in some unexpected outcomes. If I share one example, if global temperatures keep rising beyond 2 degree or 3 degree Celsius, research studies they indicate there is a higher likelihood that Indian monsoon could potentially move southward. What does that mean is there's a more rain over the ocean and less over land. That could be very devastating for countries which are dependent upon monsoon like India.
Vineet, this year marks the 20th anniversary of catastrophic floods in Mumbai. You wrote recently about how unchecked urbanization and more frequent bursts of intense rain could cause even greater losses today. So, is India and more broadly other countries in Asia more or less vulnerable now than 2 decades ago?
This is a very relevant question for our work. At Swiss Re, when we build our catastrophe models, we often ask this question, what would if this event will happen today? And for this, we look at three key risk driver: hazard, exposure, and the role of mitigation measures, how they have evolved over time. So with increased frequency of extreme events and growing asset values, in many countries in Asia Pacific, I would incline to say that we are more vulnerable unless proportionate mitigation measures are in place. Let me try to explain this with example of three cities which are widely discussed: Mumbai, Jakarta in Indonesia, and Tokyo. All are exposed to heavy rainfall, but their vulnerability has evolved differently. Mumbai faces torrential monsoon rain and also rain from cyclones, and also there is a gradual sea level rise as well. Jakarta is battling extreme rain and rapid land subsidence from groundwater extraction in many places of the order of meters. Tokyo too faced intense typhoon-induced rains, but decades of investment in flood infrastructure like underground tunnels, embankments have dramatically reduced the risk. This was clearly evident in case of Typhoon Hagibis in 2019, which resulted in extreme rain, but Tokyo largely spared the flooding. So while climate change is intensifying hazard everywhere, difference lies in planning and adaptation, and Tokyo is a great example to demonstrate that.
Andrew, does this sound familiar in an Australian context? The 2022 floods were so traumatic. What are you seeing in terms of urbanization, development trends, and exposure in flood-prone areas? Is Australia headed in the right direction, or is there still work to do?
Well, we've looked at the size of the challenge and we've been talking very actively to government about it. In fact, we're saying to government, now is the time to lean into this problem and start acting faster because the problem's not going away. In fact, it's only going to get worse. And over time, it will only become more and more expensive. The Insurance Council did a really comprehensive study last year to understand the extent of the flood risk. And we know that there's about 300,000 properties, which are both commercial and residential, that sit in very high-risk flood zones across the country. About 240,000 of them are actually homes and the rest are commercial properties. We know that the cost of trying to mitigate them all, if we were to do it all at once, would be incredibly expensive. We've costed it out to being around about 30 billion Australian dollars over 10 years. So we know they're not going to all flood at once, but we do know that when we start looking at the risk factors, we can identify those areas where the frequency event is anticipated to be much higher than others. And we can see larger areas that built infrastructure will do a very good job of protecting those assets and in the long run keep homes safe, keep people safe, keep their livelihoods together in terms of their businesses, but also bring downward pressure on insurance premiums. The problem with the flood is that it's not if it will happen again, it's just when it will happen again. And being able to use the best possible data and modelling that we've got now through both lived experience and what we can see coming, we are imploring governments to start thinking about this as a national infrastructure challenge. How can you spend some of this money on adaptation, climate adaptation, and think about it in the same way we think about defence, transport infrastructure and the like? If we're able to protect the assets of whole communities, the disruption, the dislocation, all of that comes with it can be minimised. Importantly, insurance can continue to play a role and the private market can cover this risk adequately moving forward.
Flood is hardly a new peril, but Swiss Re's data does show it's intensifying in many places where populations and economies are expanding. Andrew, you've spoken about the need for a flood defense fund in Australia. What would that look like, and how could such an initiative make insurance more affordable and risk more manageable?
Well, it is not a new phenomenon. That is correct. And in fact, for a very long time, local governments, state governments, federal governments, we have three levels of government in Australia, a little bit like the United States. What we see is they've undertaken a lot of studies to understand the hydrology of their local area. So, in fact, there's a lot of knowledge out there. There's been a lot of analysis done on what it takes to protect towns and cities from the impacts of flood. The problem is, once those studies are done, quite often very little is done about them until the pressure reaches a significant turning point. Now, we have had some communities in this country. We've had a major city in the north of Tasmania. We've had an inland town known as Roma, where basically insurance became unaffordable and therefore unavailable to most residents because of the flood risk. And at that point, we saw governments act and we saw them invest the money in building or completing flood levees. And ever since that job has been done, particularly levees that are effective and go above the maximum probable height of a flood, we're seeing those communities actually survive and thrive moving forward. But more of that needs to be done. So on the Flood Defence Fund, we're advocating that government probably needs about 30 billion Australian dollars over the next decade invested in these defences. What we want to do increasingly moving forward is also have on the top of their minds climate adaptation, protection for communities, and investing in infrastructure that will have a real return on that investment that actually will protect a community and, from an insurance perspective, potentially normalise those premiums for those people who live in those exposed areas.
Vineet, when you look at the broader APAC region, do you see similar challenges and similar opportunities for large-scale adaptation?
I would say in most part of Asia, insurance affordability is not a central issue yet because insurance penetration remains very low. The bigger challenges today are awareness of flood risk and insurance and accessibility of relevant insurance products. That said, as countries become more urbanized and richer with higher per capita income, the insurance coverage will expand in urban and coastal regions, and affordability has potential to become an issue unless risk is managed through proactive mitigation. In terms of the opportunity, I think that lies in how fast-growing cities plan for flood resilience in these countries. Asia is urbanizing rapidly, and that gives us a unique chance to design the next generation of urban center with flood risk in mind. It is much cheaper to prevent problems now than to fix them later.
Before we move on, I'd like to take a brief diversion from the challenges of flood risk in Asia and Australia to talk about a very significant adaptation effort in the United States, a $3.2 billion flood diversion project on the Red River of the North, designed to protect nearly 300,000 people in the Fargo Moorhead metropolitan area of North Dakota and Minnesota. It's also a project that Swiss Re has invested in, as the company directs its asset management activities towards supporting community efforts to adapt to intensifying natural perils. I'm here with Tony Grindberg, chairman of the Metro Flood Diversion Authority and a county commissioner in Cass County, North Dakota. Commissioner Grindberg, welcome to Risk REconsidered.
Thank you for the opportunity to share our project with your listeners.
Commissioner Grindberg, you've been involved with this project virtually from the beginning. As a state legislature more than a decade ago, what led to the realization in your community that such a major project was necessary?
Well, it was a culmination of historical trends catching up with us. In 1997, a flood was very close to inundating the entire city of Fargo. That was really predicated by record snowfall and a rapid melt. Through that spring of 1997, as the snow melt and the spring advanced, Grand Forks was inundated and flooded entirely. Then look to 2009 and 2011. Both those were nearly record floods. In fact, in 2009, there was a call by Federal Emergency Management for Fargo to evacuate. The mayor at the time said, "We're not going to evacuate, we're going to fight this flood." And literally in a matter of days, 7.3 million sandbags were put together to save the city, and we prevailed. But that's when leaders started coming together to say, we need a permanent solution. And let me step back a moment for those that are not familiar with the geography of the Red River Valley. Imagine a flat surface with tributaries all feeding the Red River and then moving north into Canada in the spring thaw. You look at the geography and then the 2009 flood in particular, what's a permanent solution look like? And that's what's advanced to what's the FM Flood Diversion Project.
The Metro Flood Diversion is scheduled for completion in 2027. How would the diversion actually protect the community?
Great question. So the public-private partnership model that we have is the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for building the control units, the control structures. So about 10 miles south of Fargo along the Red River, they have constructed a giant control structure with big gates. And times of flooding, those gates will open, and then that river will be channeled into the flood diversion channel. It extends to the west and to the north around the city. That balance of water will be diverted around. So the control structures really are how that happens. What's interesting, the number of tributaries that feed into the Red, that's really an interesting engineering feat that it's also an example of how creative this project had to be to manage all those tributaries in a spring thaw racing to the Red River. So those control structures are really where the action as far as diverting water go.
Commissioner, you've lived with the threat of flooding all your life, from your childhood along the Maple River to now, overseeing one of the largest flood adaptation projects ever undertaken. Today, as your organization points out, extreme precipitation has become more frequent since 1990, and the trend has accelerated since 2015. Does it feel like your community is in a race against time before the next big flood?
The structures will be substantially complete 1 year from tomorrow, October 1st of 2026. So we're really at risk one more winter, if you will. If there was a record snowfall again and we had an event next spring, we'd have to manage that through the completion of the project. Through this last 10 years in particular, we've also had in-town flood protection, bringing levees in town to 37 feet. So a combination of the diversion with its operation and in-town protection, the days of sandbags are gone. As a kid, my father was mayor of our city and was responsible for many flood fights, and I was always assigned certain tasks. I guess I was meant to be involved in this project from a standpoint of when I was a kid, what flooding can do to devastate a family, their possessions, to a community. It takes a long time to recover. In many cases, the Grand Forks flood of 1997, the community is still trying to catch up almost 20, 30 years ago from flooding events. So it's important to do the right thing and preserve the tax base and minimize any loss of property and lives.
At Swiss Re, research shows that adaptation investments like flood infrastructure often pay for themselves many times over when catastrophes hit. Your project's price tag is significant at $3.2 billion. Is there an expectation that this initial investment will save your region's communities from far greater costs down the road?
Clearly, when you look at the valuation of schools and hospitals and public facilities to homes, there's billions of dollars of taxable valuation that's being protected by this. There's certainly been the critics of spending $3 billion on a project like this, but it's clear when you look at what it's going to preserve and protect, the benefits far outweigh the costs overall long term. Another way of looking at it, if mother of all floods showed up and took out Fargo, what would be the costs from the federal government to assist with the rebuilding? And you compare that just one major flood, if you use the example of Grand Forks, what occurred in 1997, certainly worth the investment. Adding to that, with present, there's approximately $50 million of U.S. dollars a year that are paid in flood insurance premiums. And once this diversion is operational, individual homeowners no longer will have to pay that annual premium for flood insurance, and that'll free up some disposable income for them and also stimulate the economy from a spending standpoint. This is going to preserve the tax base, which is a far better bang for the buck than it is to suffer a loss.
Commissioner, once this project is completed, how will it affect the construction standards that govern building codes in North Dakota's riverside communities?
Well, the number one example, in my opinion, is the flood requirements for flood-proofing basements that currently exist largely in the city of Fargo. The cost of that alone is generally between $30,000 and $40,000, depending on the size of the house, just with added fill and the cost of raising and size of the concrete structure. Once the diversion project is complete, that requirement will go away because no longer is there a threat of overland flooding, so a house can be built at traditional grade and thereby reducing that cost. So that'll be probably the fundamental largest impact from moving forward with cost of construction. on commercial and residential. So as you look at the density and the city's growth, Fargo's eager from their standpoint to grow by having this requirement lifted because frankly, the market dictates where people are building, and right now it's too expensive in Fargo. Plus the flood insurance going away. So that's another major impact. You take $60 million flood insurance premiums annually, you put it back into the economy. That in itself, too, will trickle down into produce economic output for the community.
This project has been complex, requiring coordination between city, county, state, and federal governments, not to mention private partners. For communities elsewhere that might be considering something similar, what advice would you give on building the coalitions necessary to move forward?
Change happens two ways: strong leadership or a crisis. And I would make the case largely that we had survived one or two crises, 1997 and 2009, which propelled human behavior change, that we have to do something different. It was because of those two close calls within about 10, 11 years, something had to change. And the call to action was start putting a plan together. When it started, there was no clear path what that plan was going to be, but there needed to be an answer to that question. And over time, that was delivered by multiple jurisdictions. And I think in our case, the evidence really spoke volumes when the local citizens taxed themselves numerous times by sales tax, not knowing what the overall endgame plan looked like, but we're going to provide local share to support this permanent flood protection quest. And that was really, I think, key for all the other pieces to come together. Certainly in my case as a state lawmaker, knowing that the significant amount of sales tax was committed made it easier to gain consensus in the legislative halls for $450 million, which was the first tranche, as well as the federal government to say, this is in our best interest, and here's how we think this might work in a public-private partnership model, which is a lot of eyes are watching this nationally, being the first in the nation. So that's intriguing and cool to be part of.
Commissioner Grindberg, thank you for sharing these insights. The Fargo Moorhead Diversion is a remarkable example of how communities can think big as they adapt to intensifying risks. Vineet and Andrew, what do you think? Can you share examples of similar projects in Australia or elsewhere, or assess where there might be additional opportunities along these lines to protect communities?
Well, Shari, in Australia, we have had a couple of examples, which I mentioned earlier on in the podcast, in the town of Roma in Queensland, where a levee wall was built around a very floodplain-exposed town, and in the north of Tasmania, the island state, and in the very south of Australia, where its second major city had a significant levee completed. And all of those had not only the effect of protecting homes, but also of normalising insurance premiums for those areas that aren't ordinarily sitting in that flood risk. What we saw after the 2022 floods, though, in Australia was both the federal and state governments in those states where the floods had the biggest impact. A lot of money was invested in rebuilding better mitigation programs. And I think it was an opportunity for Australia to start testing out at scale a few things that we've done in the past, but I've often shied away from, and governments really need to take the lead on. So, for example, in the city of Brisbane's our third largest city. It will be hosting the Olympics in 2032. It has a major river that runs through it. It had a lot of areas in the inner city that were heavily impacted and flooded. Up there, the governments together have been jointly buying back properties, ones that can't be mitigated, ones that have flooded over a number of years. And those have been bought back, and the area around those properties returned to the local council, and they're being turned into sporting fields, car parks, and the like. In addition to that, there are a lot of older timber-built homes in the city. And the great thing about timber-built homes is that they can be raised. I think the concern about raising homes is that people will still be situated in a high-risk flood zone, and I'm not sure I want to be in an area that has 30 feet of floodwater going through it. And then, of course, when we do buybacks, it has enormous community dislocation. You have people that may have lived in an area for their whole life, for example, and government is now telling them they can't return to their property. It will be bought back. So these are very challenging programs, but they're necessary, and we've got to look at them very carefully. Sometimes these tough decisions do need to be made, but there's only ever a window in which they can be made. And I think as we're learning more through these extreme weather events that deliver this sort of damage, we really need to encourage governments to be brave and make those decisions.
Vineet?
Yeah. So in India, large dams have traditionally played a major role in managing floods. An extension of these projects continue across the Ganges and Brahmaputra basin in the northern and eastern part of India, which are highly flood prone. What is becoming more relevant now with the rising urban flooding across India, several Indian cities have upgraded or having a plan to upgrade their drainage system to reflect the extreme rainfalls. So, for example, New Delhi has announced plan to modernize their century-old drainage system this year. Mumbai has been already doing this one. If I take an example outside India, Bangkok in Thailand, after 2011 Thai flood, they have been investing in various flood protection system, tunnels, embankments. Other example that comes to my mind is the Jakarta, the city where land subsidence is a big problem. So they have this giant seawall project to protect the city from sea level rise. Progress has been gradual, but it is a crucial step in adapting the flood risk there.
A critical element to building flood resilience is good data. We've seen challenges with flood maps in the U.S. and in Europe, maps that critics say often don't reflect evolving risks. Swiss Re has made big investments in water risk intelligence, including acquiring Fathom, a leader in high-resolution flood modeling, in 2023. Vineet, what does Fathom and its capabilities bring to our clients and partners?
Yeah, so if you look at the flood hazard, it is a very localized hazard. Sometimes change in few centimeter of elevation could totally change the flood risk profile. And as we have discussed, both climate change and human factors are continuously reshaping the flood risk. And I think that's where high-resolution flood modeling capabilities from Fathom becomes vital. Its detailed data helps create accurate and up-to-date flood maps that helps our client for risk selection, pricing, and the planning decisions. I think what excites me most is Fathom's hazard expertise complements Swiss Re's decades of loss modeling experience. Together, they allow our clients not just to see where they are exposed, but also quantify the potential economic and financial impact.
Final question for both of you. If you could point to a single measure you think communities could take to have the greatest impact on increasing flood resilience, whether in Australia, India, or anywhere else, what would it be? Vineet?
Yeah, I think I will go back to what I mentioned earlier. Prevention is far more cost effective than mitigation. Asia is rapidly urbanizing. And if I take the example of India, which is only 40% urbanized, hundreds of millions of people will move to the urban cities over the next decades. If we could plan that expansion really wisely, keeping the flood risk in mind, we can avoid the mistakes of the past and make the country far more flood resilient.
How about you, Andrew?
Well, as Vineet said, for every dollar invested, the return on investment is often tenfold. And I think that passes any hurdle that government would normally think about. We have the data, we have the lived loss experience, we have the modelling for the future. We stand very ready to work with you, government, on what you need to do to actually meet the commitments to adaptation that they spend a lot of time talking about, but we want to see real and tangible action happen.
Thanks so much, Vineet and Andrew, for sharing your insights on one of the world's most pressing natural perils. Flood risk clearly isn't going away, but with well-designed adaptation, better data, coordinated investment, and stakeholder cooperation, there is an opportunity to help communities both avoid catastrophes and rebound from them. That's it for this episode of Swiss Re's Risk REconsidered. I'm Shari Elliker. Thanks for listening.